Hey everyone, Nathan Long here, president of Saybrook University. Welcome to yet another episode of Saybrook Insights. We continue this week highlighting our key programs, and today we feature our amazing psychology program faculty, including the likes of Drs. Martinez, Palmisano, Sakuma, among several others. You're not going to want to miss this collective set of insights, wisdom, and more from these fabulous faculty members who walk the talk and offer a blend of psychology, philosophical musings, and important observations about the importance of mental health in today's America. All right, let's get to it with Psychology in Action. And so what is it about Saybrook that sets it apart from other institutions from your perspective?
Oh, it's the commitment to old school humanistic psychology, like the lineage continues. If there was like some kind of psychological apostolic succession, like we can go from the big dogs like right down to us today, like in really great pathways. We thus far don't have much involvement with APA beyond thinking that they're great and we should take their recommendations, but we don't need their accreditation just yet. And that gives us a certain freedom to teach what we feel is important.
You describe from a therapist's point of view and then maybe an educator's point of view what this humanistic thing is, what it isn't, what it looks like when applied, etc.
Yeah, so humanistic psychology really was founded in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But before that, there was many different cultural contexts that were already talking about these same human ideas. So from an indigenous perspective or from a feminist perspective, these ideas have been around for a very long time. It wasn't put in language, put in context in a psychological way until the 1950s. So what it means to be a humanistic psychologist or humanistic educator is that you are looking at humans as larger than the sum of their parts. And what that means is that you steep them in a context. So instead of reducing someone to, for example, a student role, which implies that they're coming in almost as a blank slate, like mold me, teach me, tell me what your wisdom is, we accept that people come in with their own wisdom and experiences. And even understanding that they come with a lineage attached to them as well. So there's like an ancestral wisdom that is inherent in people. And so humanistic psychologists believe that there is a natural growth potential, that even if we don't interfere at all, humans are already on a path to growing and to be moving towards their highest potential. So as psychologists, our role is to be more of a guide or a mentor. So we collaborate, we co-create the therapeutic experience with our clients. And we do the same thing as humanistic educators too. So with our students, we are asking them to share what their wisdom and experiences are, which sometimes that means is going to place my students at a expert level that's greater than my own as a professor. And I'm okay with that because there are certain areas where I have more expertise than my students. And so in that way, we're co-creating the classroom even.
Maybe talk about how this violence, this trauma affects kids, especially as someone who's worked with children and across the lifespan, of course. Be curious your thoughts on that, and then maybe we can get into some of the other issues around gun violence here in America. But we'll save that for later if we have time.
Well, the effects on kids, thinking from a strictly a social learning background, we know that just witnessing parental violence, it's almost like within the last 20 years, we started looking at it as far as something that we need to consider. It's not just experiencing a form of physical abuse or any other abuse. It's actually witnessing the violence that can be just as traumatic. And so witnessing an act like something in Uvalde, I remember the school shooting that happened probably 3 years ago. I can't tell you which one it was, but I remember having this visceral response and going up to my whiteboard and just started writing down a program, because programs are one of the things I like doing. I like building things. And so I was just like all over that board. And really what it was I was just angry and I was upset because I was like, come on, we got to do something about this. And I just started listing all these things that we could do in our communities, because it's almost like you can see it coming. I remember one of the first, when you look at some of the early studies with children, and you put a gun in front of them, and the experimenter leaves the room, and he tells them, "Hey, now don't touch the gun." Kid's like, "Okay, no problem." Leaves the room, and what happened? Kid touches the gun, and kids are naturally drawn to things that are associated with power, that are salient, that are attractive. When we looked at things in television and the effects of television on children, all of those things make that model more powerful. And so that child looks to that powerful person, and so, or superhero, or whatever it is. And so when you talk about school shootings, there's a sense of power that I think people get that engage in something like that, and because of the fear.
So as you look at kind of the scope of practice right now, and you're talking about trauma, how did you say it? Not trauma-informed, but
Trauma responsive.
trauma-responsive. I've heard that used a lot, and I guess I'll go this way. Tell me what that means. So, like, if someone,
Okay.
how is that an add-on that's going to be beneficial? I mean, I think I know. Would love to hear it.
So the old term trauma informed, what they realized is that a lot of organizations were trauma informed, meaning they had knowledge about trauma, they understood it, they understood the principles, the theories, but they weren't utilizing the knowledge, and they weren't implementing it when they were working with people. So they switched to being trauma responsive, which means that you're going to take your knowledge that you have about traumatic stress and trauma and how to treat it and all of that, and you're actually going to implement it as you're working with people and then working with community.
For our audience, if you haven't seen the body of Dr. Schneider's work, it's pretty impressive, and he's written a number of really powerful works, I think, not least of which is on the polarized mind. You and I had the pleasure of talking through that book a few years back, as you recall. And in my introduction today, I spent some time talking about our country's polarization, noting my own journey in trying to do better in this space. And given your work in this area, and I know it's kind of a hard shift away from just the kind of very esoteric but incredible stuff you were just talking about, but we're in really strange times, Kirk. And if you could talk about about the book, The Polarized Mind, what it entails, and what are the promises and pitfalls ahead? How does humanistic psychology flow in and out of this as you see it? So I appreciate your willingness to kind of shift a bit in this way.
Well, I was really trying to get at the roots of what drives people toward extremes, malignant extremes, destructive extremes, which I call the polarized mind. And I was drawing from all kinds of research, mainly existential depth psychology, and also anthropology, sociology, some writings about religion and spirituality. And through that immersion and through my own and my personal experience with some difficult people, I grew up in a very mixed neighborhood. We were the only Jewish family in the neighborhood. Had a lot of wonderful experiences with the kids, but also some rather unsettling experiences. Anyway, that aside, drawing from all this, so I came up with what I thought was a pretty good phenomenological definition of the polarized mind. That is, that it's the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And I think that definition really covers a lot of what we call individual psychopathology, from anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsion, drugs that sedate, being polarized in the contrasting direction, sociopathy, narcissism, speed, etc. The problem of not being able to deal with feeling of insignificance. My sense is that polarized mind and extremist behavior and experience is fear-based. It's defensive in many ways. And it basically has to do with doing everything one can to avoid the sense of smallness, helplessness, and ultimately being wiped away. I mean, what the terror management theorists would call death angel.
There's controversy in some camps about existential psychology, about whether it's, maybe not the legitimacy of it, but is it a viable technique? And I thought maybe you could speak a little bit to that in terms of its use as a therapeutic intervention among many. What does that look like in practice, especially from someone who is a practitioner as well as a scholar?
You're putting me in mind of an interview I saw that I sometimes use for classes with Gordon Wheeler, who is a Gestalt therapist. And the interviewer asked him, how he ultimately came to be a Gestalt therapist. And his response to that would be really similar to my own, which is that when we're all graduate students in clinical psychology, learning psychotherapy, and we're learning about the various psychotherapeutic approaches, we tend to see ourselves reflected to varying degrees in each of the theoretical paradigms. And ultimately, of course, many of us who do clinical work end up working integratively, and I am, no exception to that. I certainly do that. But existential humanistic psychology and psychotherapy is the foundation of my integrative work because it's the approach that I most see myself reflected in. So when we think about working with clients and doing psychotherapy, it's the approach that most reflects what I think therapy needs to be about and for, more than the other approaches. And I am a therapist who is not particularly attached to working with insurance companies. So I end up taking very low fees for my work because Saybrook, the Chicago School, and other academic institutions pay my bills nicely. And, any consultation work that I do, any workshops that I give, I can keep my therapy rates really low. This allows me to work with the freedom without insurance companies breathing over my shoulder, trying to micromanage what I do. So any judgment I might get about how long I work with a client or the so-called rigid reductive measures of empirical efficacy, which I challenge and counter with what is the nature of evidence itself at the end of the day, and what about practice-based evidence? I think there's a lot of practice-based evidence in doing existential humanistic psychotherapy work with clients.
When I hear therapist, because I am not a therapist, most of our folks know this, I'm often marveling at the fact that we talk about God or religion or spirituality in that very constrained context often as therapists. And I still heard a little bit of that at Saybrook when I came in. I think that continues to evolve in all the various mental health disciplines and professions. And what I love about Saybrook is we're always working to be more inclusive and more thoughtful about that. How do we, from your perspective, how are we doing as a profession in psychology, counseling, social work, in addressing this issue of religion as part of the therapeutic process, and more generally spirituality? And I know the two aren't exactly connected, but they're in that sense. But what are your thoughts on that? It's a big question.
It is, but I can see the answer. I think it's, as she throws her notes off to the side and rolls up her sleeves.
Takes a big gulp of water.
It's embedded in everything that we do, so it's foundational. But I think we treat it as a cultural consideration, and as a point of unconditional positive regard, right? I have to how you construct your reality and the meaning, like what's running your show, is of importance to me, right? I need to know that to help you. Got to know all the bells and whistles of that. And everybody's is different. And we should never assume we know. Even if we think we're in the same club, we might not be. So spiritual competencies sort of say, hey, you got to get to know this person's thing, which I just think is so much fun. And Saybrook would totally agree with that. Absolutely. You got to get to know their thing, right? For many different reasons. Spirituality is one of them. There's a few other good ones too.
Such as?
The code of ethics would say that you can't treat somebody that you don't know. It's how you're going to build rapport. It's, Rogers CEUs, I call them. It's how you are congruent and empathic and show unconditional positive regard, right? You ask questions, you go, oh my God, was it like this? Did it feel like that? Oh, it must have been this way, that way. And they go, yeah. Or they go, no. But either way, you learn, right? And you connect. And that's all sort of the same thing.
Let's get into some of the controversy, though, around, like, some people would say, well, that's kind of, I'll just play devil's advocate because, I'm a supporter. But I think at the other end of the extreme, some people would say, well, that's kind of a cop-out, right? Like, people want led, people want taught. I mean, like, this co-creating of experiences, is that really teaching? Is that really therapy? Is that really just kind of letting the tail wag the dog, so to speak? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say that that's a really limiting perspective, and we call that like reductionist in the humanistic lens. So what we're doing there is it's almost like if we think about the rote memorization model that we all were trained in high school and in undergraduate school. That is very limiting because what happens is we memorize all of that knowledge we are filled with, and then the moment we leave that institution, half of it's garbage. We forget it. It just goes out of our brain, right? So if we instead look at what the human potential is and tap into what each individual is bringing, we tap into their passion. We tap into what's meaningful to them as humans, and we start to synthesize knowledge. And so what our students end up doing is that when I teach them something, for example, right now I'm teaching developmental psychology, I'm asking them, tell me a story that relates to these stage theories that we're going to memorize still. We're going to know them very deeply because you're required to, but we're going to know them so deeply that you're going to attach them to memories and wisdom that you're already coming in with. And so it actually ends up being a much deeper level of learning.
I guess I just worry because, to your point earlier, there's so many that are basically now being consigned to schools that are almost prison-like, in terms of what they look like and what they do. But maybe that's part of just the new reality that we need to live in. What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious.
It is a younger age group that are doing these school shootings. The last data that I looked at, I think there may be one person that wasn't, but we're looking at 18, I believe, teens that age, at the oldest maybe. And so it is part of the new reality, walking into these schools, sending your kids off, understanding shooter drills, getting emails, hey, this is just a test, getting texts, hey, this is just a test, it's green today, hey, there's a yellow. And I guess the thing that worries me is over time people get they get used to.
There are some out there who are saying that we're ginning up the trauma side of the equation, that older kind of mindset that rub a little dirt on it, let's get moving, stop whining, stop complaining. Can you talk to that mindset a little bit and what we're trying to do with this different approach?
Yeah, and that, I'm very familiar with that because that's what I face, and that's what I continue to face when I go work and move about in fire service community. So it's the suck it up mentality, so you got her, just suck it up and keep moving. What I found, that'll work for a little while, but eventually as the different events and things you experience and you haven't really dealt with the first thing, so a second thing gets piled on, and eventually you get a person that, what I'm seeing a lot of recently since COVID is people dealing with complex trauma. So people were already dealing with past traumas from life and childhood and everything else, and now this is being piled on top, and they were doing pretty good. They were functioning, they were taking care of their families to a point. They weren't the most healthiest person, but they weren't the worst off either. But when these new events happen, they just begin to spiral. And that's what I'm seeing a lot of that's walking through our doors as a practice. And I think there's a balance there. It's not an either or. I think, even when you're doing treatment and you're working with clients, one of the things you have to be mindful of is you are constantly walking this balance of, okay, I know you went through these traumatic events, but also how do we help you to move forward and heal from that? So it's not about just, we're going to sit here and just lament and talk about this for 2 years, and we're not going to try to bring a healing process that you can begin to thrive again in your life. So I think it's a both. And in some instances, I'm going to be honest with you, when I first started treating trauma and working with people that were dealing with trauma, I used to think everybody had to tell me all of their deep, dark, details of what they had gone through, and they had to actually deal with the trauma, and we had to face it. And what I've learned over the years is that that doesn't work for everybody.
Some of the more recent statistics are showing somewhere in the realm of 111 to 120 million people in the United States alone. That does not even account for an underserved global population who are not receiving needed mental health services at all.
That's right.
And you raised, this platform of yours is so timely on multiple levels, placing polarization over here for a moment just to get basic services for our communities that are, the tyrannies that are ravaging our brothers and sisters across the country. It's pretty wicked. And this is innovative thinking, Kirk. And where is this at in terms of people buying into this concept? I mean, are you seeing interest? Is there resistance? What are your?
Well, I'm definitely seeing interest. I mean, I'm seeing interest in, for example, the webinars I've been presenting, experiential democracy, which is a one-on-one structured dialogue. Certainly, Braver Angels has attracted a good number of people. I think they've had 10,000 last count across the country doing these groups. Within APA, there's growing interest. I mean, I'll be doing. I did a seminar for the New York State Psychological Association on this, or the California State Psychological Association. Various groups are expressing more and more interest. I think there's a lot of interest in giving psychology away, so to speak, at such a critical time. And really going after a deeper, a more substantive dimension of our psychology, seeing the value of asking bigger questions and helping people to, address, especially their primal feelings of otherness. But so much of this, again, is fear-driven. So many of the problems we have in getting, again, emotional restorative relationships with people who presumably, and I think in many, many cases are very skillful in offering the kind of mentoring and healing that so many people need. I am seeing it emerge. It's an uphill battle, but I feel passionate about it.
How do you teach these very weighty concepts with your students, whether it's an A class or a series of classes? And particularly, what does an online course in these look like for existential humanistic work that you're doing?
Thank you. I sometimes will ruminate how to bring this sense of presence with a capital P that we like to bring to therapy and that I like to bring to an in-person classroom. I loved when I was concentrating heavily on brick and mortar in-person teaching because the passion, everything that inspires me, my humor, such as it is right there fully online. And I have a captive audience, in real time for all of those things. I ruminate about how to bring that presence to the online forum as well. And there's no doubt that a Zoom live session can approximate that better than an asynchronous discussion forum or writing assignment. But even in those forums, what I try to do, just as I do in live Zoom sessions, is to self-disclose all over the place. I feel like what comes most easily to me is to share my organic excitement because I feel like it isn't heady. It's more hearty, like HEARTY to me. It comes from that place in me. It comes from my gut, my heart, and my soul. And when I share my excitement about what it has meant for me in my life and how it's transformed my way of looking at myself, others, and the world and the future, if I may borrow from Aaron Beck's cognitive triad, I think it becomes a little infectious. And I am fortunate at Saybrook to have students who are already excited and interested in it, but then they hear my excitement. And if I can somehow put it into the written form in my responses to them in the async forums, but I can really let loose in live sessions when we can schedule those. And it can be challenging to coordinate everybody's schedules to do those, more than occasionally. But even if I have only a few opportunities, I try to bring all of that fully online.
Work with emotional support animals or in that area, right? I was super impressed by that line of work and kind of some of the areas that you were in. And I laugh because, I remember it was 2004. And I swear to God, I thought, this woman bringing her dog on. I'm like, why is this dog on the plane? And she said, it's my emotional support animal. And at the time, I thought that was just nuts. I just did not get it.
Somebody made it up. Yeah.
Yeah. And you and I were talking a little bit before we got started. And I had a shift in my perspective. And I've really seen, we've had some students who have emotional support animals. It's made such a huge difference. And beyond that, some who have really, their animals are assistive in nature in terms of the, blind students or visually impaired, I should say, and the like. So tell us a bit about your journey in this space and what you've done and the research you've done and what you're finding.
That's big too. But it starts with the APA Division 17, Counseling Psychology. And underneath the division, they have a section 13, Human-Animal Interactions. And so they are sort of doing all of the human-animal sciences research, and they're currently free to join. So they have a pretty big body of people. And I was on the board, and I think it was around the time that the crocodile showed up on the plane, the emotional support crocodile, a few other things. People were starting to get a lot of phone calls asking for these letters certifying their dog as an emotional support animal. It seemed like a fair amount of them were about being able to fly for free or being able to be in housing that was no animal housing. Some of them were completely legit, and nobody knew what to do with any of this. And so we just looked at sort of liability welfare and animal welfare. And it turns out to be super complicated. If, as a psychologist, you have a therapeutic relationship with your clients, and then you flip into a forensic evaluation of them, which is necessary to declare them disabled so that their dog becomes an ESA. Now you're forensic, and now you're in a dual relationship, and that's not allowed in the Code of Ethics. That's just one piece. What if something goes wrong? Now your relationship is damaged. You put your client in danger. No one ever lays eyeballs on the dog. They just write letters without seeing what the dog is like, how it is in a crowd, can it live in this space, has it ever seen a vet, like all these things. There's just so many things that aren't being taken into consideration. So first we wrote considerations for psychologists. If you're going to write a letter, here are the risks, here's what you need to know, and here's what you need to do. And then a little bit later, we wrote the animal welfare piece, which says, you know what, your dog gets to say if they want to come or not. Like they have like a union, right? They don't have to work a certain number of hours before they get a break, and they have to be healthy, and it has to be reasonable, and they obviously have to like it and be trained and have all the shots. And so these were things you maybe want to see.
Given the current mental health crisis, there is such a vast need for therapists right now. And when we say mental health crisis, I mean, I don't know that it is accurately defined. Some people would say, is it really a crisis? I don't know. But I think for a lot of folks in America, across the country, at least here, they are feeling it, right? Whether it's the increase in drug and alcohol use, suicidal ideation, you name it, it's out there, and it's increasing in intensity for many. From a humanistic approach and from how you're seeing things as a therapist, as an educator, what are your thoughts on the crisis, and how do we start to chip away at this in a way that's meaningful, that's going to help us advance? Because right now it feels like we're stuck in neutral.
Yeah, the mental health crisis is real. That there are facts that support that. We have the highest number right now of suicides per capita. We have, because of COVID, we're noticing that about 20% of individuals who have had COVID end up with depression or anxiety as a result of having COVID, not to mention just the isolation that's been occurring because of the pandemic. We have huge transitions, financial transitions, people who are working from home now, people who are raising children at home while trying to work from home. And so all of those are compounding into a really stressful culture that we're experiencing in the United States. Meanwhile, we're also seeing difficulties in the behavioral health workforce. And so some states are making it more difficult for licensing to occur. And in addition to that, the licensing boards, they're stressed too because of the staff shortage. And so it's kind of just all these compounding factors making it so that when an individual goes to find a therapist, one, they have to find one that they can afford. And that means tapping into what their health insurance is going to allow them to see. Health insurance companies, I had just waited 14 months to get paneled with one health insurance company because of their own staff shortages. And so that meant that individuals with that health insurance weren't able to access somebody who was willing to take them on.
What are a few things that you think we could do to support our kids in our communities?
Kids need to be kids. Kids need to be able to talk about things. They need to be encouraged to be able to talk about things. They need each other. They need to be able to work things out within their own groups and not always somebody interfering with them about how to work things out. They need to work things out as a group of kids. It's like trying to prescribe a treatment for somebody. We can't overprotect our children either. And that becomes really difficult because I don't know if you heard of the Jefferson High School incident that occurred in San Antonio just a few weeks ago, where something went out about a potential shooting or something going on like that. And the parents came in and they wanted to get into that school. And so there was some conflict with the police there. And when they talk about that now, they're talking about that was a reaction to what happened in Uvalde. And so we don't know where it's going to go, but we know parents are going to become more and more proactive in trying to avert anything that might go on in the school, which is just a different world. It's just a different reality.
Prospective students thinking about a career in clinical psychology, what are 2 or 3 pieces of advice you give them?
First thing I would give them is to have some kind of idea what you're going to do with the degree, because you're going to need that at certain points of the degree program. Because what I say about a doctoral program, and I'm a professor now, that we give you more work than you're capable of doing, and we expect you to do it because we're training you to be an expert. So have an idea of what you may not have it fully, but what you want to do with that degree, because that goal will push you through those hard times when you're ready to give up. And if you can, find a mentor, find someone to, it may be in the faculty or it may be a psychologist in your community that can help guide you and direct you.
I love that. All right. That's great. All right. Quick take number 2. What does the term humanistic mean to you?
Well, what I talked about earlier, I believe it means promoting an environment of caring for people and mutual respect for people. But I also believe that has to encompass addressing the social justice ills that those persons are facing, also being multicultural, and also being an advocate when you can for those persons.
Right at the top of your head, Kirk, the first one is, what does the term humanistic ultimately mean to you?
Formally, I would define humanistic psychology as 2 basic questions. What does it mean to be fully experientially human? And the second part of that follows from it is, what does that then imply for the vital or fulfilled life? So it's got a sort of descriptive aspect and an ethical, moral aspect. Less formally, I would say the humanistic psychology movement in America, fostered by folks like Maslow and May and Rogers, was really focused very much on intimacy, intimate human experience, intimate relationship, and being able to be more present to those kinds of deeper, intimate connections, and to some degree distinguishing itself from European tendencies toward abstraction and more of the philosophical. Of course, they would say that we're lacking. And also the can-do, practical, optimistic quality that humanistic psychology brings. I think that's partly an American trait. We believe in possibilities, pursuing possibilities, saying yes in spite of all the no's.
That's fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, and then the last quick take. What are 3 things people can do right now to improve their mental health?
Well, I do think taking time to reflect on what deeply matters to you. And if there was ever a time to really take stock, this certainly would be such a time. Given that so many of us are isolated and so bombarded by the pandemic and so many of the social crises going on. The whole question of what deeply matters to you and how can you engage? And that often brings up questions about maybe volunteering in some for the betterment of our world. And certainly if you're a psychotherapist, maybe thinking about ways that you can be more accessible to all the suffering, or many suffering people. But there's a whole variety of ways. The point is taking time to be more present, again, more aligned with your core sense of how you want to use your time and space, which is fleeting, to realize that we're dying as we're living. And this ain't a dress rehearsal, as an old friend put it. That's right. It's time to do it. So that's one, I would say, depth, existential, and experiential therapies can be very valuable, certainly critical in my own life. And I had a second therapy that I mentioned. It's life-changing for me in my graduate years. And then finally, I would say, I believe strongly in cultivating a sense of awe to the degree you can, awe toward living. If you can attempt to really notice and see the more of what is going on around you, beyond the often narrow and oppressive identifications we get into. We're so judgmental to ourselves, pounding or hammering ourselves. We see such horrors, obviously, on the news. One could get buried in that negativity. And I'm not saying that there's not a value to really acknowledging. Yes, acknowledge it, but also see the amazement of what's around us, the beauty of nature, the beauty of your relationships, let's say, with people, or relationships you're trying to cultivate, the beauty of inquiry. There's more that we can be open to. It's so you're like seeing with the artists, and it's extremely enriching and gratifying. One can be in that space. Humility and wonder, sense of adventure.
I want you to spend just a few minutes today talking to us about this incredible specialization that you coordinate, you lead for the university. And for those who are just tuning in to Saybrook and getting to know us, Saybrook University was founded as the Humanistic Psychology Institute back in 1971, and we changed our name in 1981 to the Saybrook Institute, and really reflective of our founding history back in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, but really clinging to that humanistic legacy. We branched out, if you will. So we have a lot of programs out there, I think 30 master's and PhD programs across a wide array of disciplines. But psychology has always been our core focus, and the humanistic psychology program, the research psychology program, really emphasizes that humanistic lineage. So maybe, Drake, if you could talk about what the specialization entails, both at the master's and PhD level, the focuses, et cetera.
Well, and, I'm very grateful to sort of have picked up the specialization from the extensive work that Lewis Hoffman did with the specialization, and I think for a while, Francis Kaklauskas, I can never say his name, did some great work with it as well. So here I am, and again, I'm always conscious that I'm in charge of this specialization that, as you say, is the container of the legacy of Saybrook, and I don't know how accurate it is to say, but it sometimes feels to me experientially like Saybrook bloomed as this marvelous thing from this legacy, and we're holding that seed that still is very productive and throwing off shoots. But so much of what Saybrook has become kind of came out of all of that. And gosh, I think of the CSIH specialization and how the College of Integrative Medicine and Health Sciences sort of, blossomed from that in a similar way. And so it reminds me of sort of the sacredness of my duty as the legacy carrier. So yes, as you mentioned, we have an MA emphasis for 2 years where we give students kind of a grounded, supportive understanding of those concepts. So, for instance, they will have the foundations of existential humanistic psychology, and some of the first part of all of those courses, and then there'll be like a second part of some of those courses for the PhD program. So at the master's level, they'll learn enough to be dangerous. It'll be something that I think is for those who want to really enrich their engagement, like maybe they're artists or maybe they're teachers, maybe they work in a corporate kind of context, but they're hungry for a master's degree that feels like it has some depth that will allow them to engage relationally with people at a level that this sort of sets them apart from the way others engage. And it gives them kind of a sense of groundedness in challenging times, ultimately. And they have the value of that master's degree in terms of the higher learning aspects. But I find that those who take on the MA degree, they may not be seeking as much of the practical benefit of that as others might be in a business sense, but they really want that expanded relational quality and an understanding of the world, and maybe to enhance their own way of writing about the world or teaching about the world. In the PhD, we'll have both clinicians come into that who already have degrees at the master's level, maybe in marriage and family therapy or counseling or social work. We'll have those who have master's degrees from other disciplines, or people who come from various disciplines who want the psychology PhD not to become a clinical psychologist, but, they might be doing a lot of clinical work at the master's level that they're already happy with. But this expansive immersion at the PhD level gives them a very deep immersion in the existential humanistic therapy approach. So they'll use that with their clients. If they're coming from other disciplines, I find that they're wanting to really get into teaching and research substantively in existential humanistic psychology traditions.
They were fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us today to hear those insights. If you want to see the YouTube version, you know what to do. Please visit our Saybrook YouTube page. And if you'd like to support the podcast, go to Apple iTunes and leave that 5-star rating and review. Subscribe so you can get episodes as they come out. If you're on Spotify, leave that 5-star rating and make sure to follow us. You can, of course, subscribe to us on most of the other major podcast platforms, including Amazon, Google, Stitcher, Pandora, and more. Remember to check our show notes for information on today's episode, including links to websites, books, and the like. For more about our university, go to www.saybrook.edu, click on Areas of Study at the top of the page, and locate the program of your choice to learn more. Or simply Google Saybrook University. That's it for now, folks. We'll see you next week. Take care and be well.